Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great start. This week, we're looking at a commander who is most enchanting, Tuvasa the Sunlit. Tuvasa the Sunlit is a 3-mana 1/1 Merfolk Shaman who gets +1/+1 for each enchantment we control, and whenever we cast our first enchantment spell each turn, lets us draw a card. Tuvasa's page contains many creatures just like her, enchantresses that draw lots of cards for lots of enchantments. With her buff, Tuvasa is not just an engine, but a win condition. Alright, let's get Tuvasa's average decklist and load it into the Architect deck building website. Remember, any swaps that we make must be either cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. We've got a lot of really awesome enchantments going on here. Including enchantment creatures, we've got about 38 enchantments in the deck. That's an awesome sign for Tuvasa to both get swole and keep the deck's engine chugging. These are the main areas where I'd like to make some improvements. Budget, removal, and Voltron. First up, budget. Up with the average, but down with the price. Enlightened Tutor, $50. Cyclonic Rift, $40. Rhystic Study is getting a reprint soon, but for the time being, it's still showing at $30. And you know what Enchantress decks are really good at doing? Drawing lots of cards. Budget Tuvasa will still keep a really full hand, so if you don't have cards like this, don't sweat it. The deck doesn't need this many expensive cards. Heck, Sterling Grove, Mirari's Wake, also nearing $20 each. These cards are great, but so is Tuvasa. In fact, so is Tuvasa's strategy. She herself may only draw us one card per turn, but the other enchantresses in the deck can go bonkers. It is not uncommon to see an enchantress deck cast 3 or 4 enchantments in one turn and draw like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 cards as a result. In other words, leaning into these strengths lets the deck thrive on a budget because the collective strategy allows the cards to complement each other in such a way that we don't need to rely on any individual, powerful, expensive standouts. I'd like to make some swaps in here for the big money cards. If you can't find a Smothering Tithe right now, that's fine. Let's play a Market Festival here. This deck already has a Dawn's Reflection, so why not this one too? Fierce Guardianship can swap straight across for Stubborn Denial too. Much nicer on the wallet, and the spells we want to counter tend to be the ones that compromise Tuvasa's safety. Argothian Enchantress is pretty spendy too, so if you can't get this one, try out Femeref Enchantress instead as a funny backup. It's not a card that proactively keeps the engine going necessarily, but it does help us completely refill in case our enchantments ever get wiped out. Replenish is also a pretty big barrier wallet-wise, but Tuvasa, unlike some other Enchantress strategies, leans a lot into auras, something we'll emphasize a bit more later. So for now, the much less expensive Retether can help Tuvasa get back any auras that may have been lost earlier in the game. There's one more budget cut that I'll make here, and that's the card Karmic Justice. This is a really great deterrent to make sure that no one gets rid of our enchantments, but it's also hovering around the $10, $12 mark. We can cut this one here and segue nicely into its replacements with our next category, removal. In an episode of the EDHREC podcast, we noted something really cool within the data for Tuvasa. As her average deck building budget increases, so too does the amount of removal that the deck tends to run, even when those removal spells tend to be really budget cards themselves. This is simply because removal spells help power up Tuvasa. Tuvasa's in a unique space where locking down our opponent's game pieces not only prevents them from winning, but also gives us a direct line to win. And if the players who have put a lot of money into their Tuvasa decks are also running a lot of budget removal, I just think that we should follow suit. The seals are our first add. These are great because we can respond with them at any time, trigger our enchantresses and constellation effects, and buff up our commander. I was frankly surprised not to see them in the original average list. The same is true for Kenrith's Transformation and Lignify, which render enemy commanders completely moot. They join the likes of Darksteel Mutation and Imprison in the Moon in the list to nullify important creatures in ways that many opponents are just never able to undo. Importantly, these don't reduce the commander to the level of easy destruction or skull clamp ability, which is actually really good for us, and Tuvasa's myriad evasive auras will help make sure that our opponents are never able to use these hampered commanders to block us. Song of the Dryads would be a great grab too if you have the capital for it, but it's more expensive right now than some of the cards that I cut earlier, so keep an eye on this one and see if it gets a reprint anytime soon. Not all removal is created equal though. I'm cutting Oblivion Ring here. 3 mana to get rid of 1 permanent temporarily because an opponent can remove this and get their thing back. This is especially bad to use on any cards that have ETB effects. Hopefully Wizards of the Coast will reprint Grasp of Fate soon, which scales much better to the multiplayer setting. I'm going to take a small left turn here in the removal section and discuss removal as it relates to Tuvasa. Like so many commanders, she's a removal magnet, and I'm surprised that there aren't more ways to blank enemy removal spells in this list. First, Hex Proof. Tuvasa has 3 auras that can protect her extraordinarily well. We'll start with Shielding Plaques. What rocks here is that it'll draw us 2 cards, not just 1. And of course, it buffs Tuvasa up. We don't have Boots and Greaves here, so an aura that protects, buffs, and draws cards, I'm here for it. Additionally, let's include Canopy Cover and Alpha Authority, which not only give our commander hexproof, but also make her harder to block. The other options I want to throw in here have to do with enemy attempts to destroy Tuvasa. We could try some expensive auras that give her indestructibility, but 4 mana isn't ideal when we want to cast multiple enchantments in one turn to chain through multiple Enchantress triggers. Rather, we can use some cheap totem armor cards, Hyena Umbra and Spider Umbra. If Tuvasa would be destroyed, these go away instead. There's one more I'm adding in here too, one that can be used in response to board wipes, Eel Umbra. I know these probably seem inconsequential, but if our deck hinges on Tuvasa, we'll never feel more safe deploying her than when we have a method of protecting her, especially with cheap auras that we can enchant her with as soon as she comes out. Eel Umbra in particular is important because it has flash, so we can respond to removal and or cast it on another player's turn just to have Tuvasa trigger again and get the first enchantment draw trigger. Speaking of which, I won't make this an official ad for budget reasons, but Leyline of Anticipation lets us cast enchantments on other players' turns to trigger Tuvasa multiple times around. Just an idea if you want to splurge on this deck. The final card I'll mention here is a card that is supposed to help us recover from removal, but which I'm going to end up cutting. Creeping Renaissance. It can get back our enchantments from the graveyard, but this card hasn't ever really worked out like I've ever wanted it to, I'm afraid. And I think Tuvasa can get away with looking forward instead of looking back. She and her other enchantresses draw so many cards anyway that she recovers really nicely on her own, and will get lots of enchantments back to hand soon enough anyway. Alright, part 3. Time to assemble Voltron. This deck is all about suiting up one big baddie. We've already found some ways to help protect it against removal, but now let's find some ways to make it remove our opponents. One of the most important facets of a Voltron deck isn't just that we make our commander big, or that we protect them, but also that we make it impossible for our opponents to get in their way. To complement the card Unquestioned Authority in the main deck, I'm also going to include Spirit Mantle. Protection from creatures makes Tuvasa a great blocker and an even better attacker. And this actually reminds me of a swap I'd like to make. Unflinching Courage is in the main deck, and it's perfectly good, but why isn't Steel of the Godhead in here? It gives her just as much power and doesn't just make her tramply, but unblockable. Before I just keep adding cards though, I obviously need to cut cards to make room for some of these, and this is where I'd like to address some of the deck's win conditions other than Tuvasa, because, well, some of them just get in the way. I know the phrase is don't put all your eggs in one basket, but that's always struck me as a strange phrasing for that philosophy. Like, I get the fear. If you put all of your efforts into one specific plan and that plan fails, you'll be left with nothing. And that fear is especially present for aura decks. If your commander's all suited up and then your commander gets removed, not only are you down a card because you lost your commander, you're down a lot of other cards because now your auras have fallen away too. Here's the thing though. In terms of carrying eggs, Tuvasa's a really good basket. Okay, so at least, like, the other options we have to carry eggs aren't exactly really great vessels either. And sometimes putting a lot of eggs into a basket makes that basket better at carrying them. This metaphor is falling apart on me. Maybe some specific card examples will help illustrate this point. Yavimaya Enchantress isn't going to be lethal enough to justify inclusion here. Tuvasa can probably kill an enemy in 2 hits. Yavimaya Enchantress might kill someone in 4, optimistically, sometimes. It's a non-enchantment permanent that is less effective than the thing we already want our commander to do, and more importantly, it stops our draw train dead in its tracks. Away with it. I'm going to slice the enchantment cost reducers too, not because they don't have enough targets to reduce, but because they also disrupt the deck's flow. Enchantress players know the sheer joy of chaining multiple cheap enchantments in one turn, but hitting a brick wall if they flood out with too many creatures or lands in hand. It's a lot like when a cycling deck runs out of cards to cycle. The engine sputters to a halt. Non-enchantment permanents have to be extremely worth it, and the more streamlined this deck becomes, the less necessary these cards become. I'm cutting this Helm of the Gods for the same reason. We want an enchantment that does this effect, not an artifact. Artifacts don't draw us cards. This card pumps us up for each enchantment, but ironically gets in the way of our ability to acquire more of them. Kestia the Cultivator is cute here too, but she's either an expensive bad aura or a slow card advantage engine. She's a creative commander in her own right, but she just isn't well served here. Starfield of Nyx is also a liability, not a win condition. Making our enchantments into creatures means a Wrath sets us back to square one. Now, I don't want to remove all the non-Tuvasa win conditions. Sharknado and Sigil can be very potent, and Ajani's Chosen and the Archon are slower than I usually like, but still quite suitable. I also kind of admire Destiny Spinner, because it keeps our stuff uncounterable and can even turn a defensive board full of propagandas and sphere of safeties into an actual clock, and it is, of course, an enchantment itself. Oh, and speaking of enchantment creatures, Nylea's Colossus should never, ever be underestimated. But cards like Starfield and Yavimaya Enchantress just won't help us win games. In fact, diversifying our threats dilutes the deck. Making Tuvasa powerful is a way of protecting her. By amping up her power, she becomes lethal much more quickly. And player removal is a great way to make sure that that person can't point destruction effects our way anymore. Put simply, offense can be our defense. Alright, this may seem a little weird, but I'm actually cutting one final thing here. Archetype of Imagination. I know, it's weird, but hear me out. Archetype makes a board impossible to block, but Tuvasa already has ways of making herself impossible to block. So that's redundant for the main strategy. Archetype could help with our other win condition token options by making them harder to block, but, well, the ideal situation where those cards become lethal is when we already have enough of those tokens to swarm the board anyhow. Archetype is not a bad card by any means, it just doesn't complement these particular win conditions or fill any of their gaps. So now let's focus on pumping up Tuvasa. Ancestral Mask already appears in the average list, and anyone who's played it knows how bonkers it can be. I'll include two other aura buffs here, Auramancer's Guise and Sage's Reverie. Not quite as potent as the mask, but I really don't know that I can describe how crestfallen I've personally become whenever I've seen a Tuvasa player cast either one of these cards. Like, they read as win more cards, cards that only help amplify a board that's already in a pretty advantageous place to begin with, but that's not really what they do. What they do is take what appears to be a safe 6 or 7 power Tuvasa and suddenly exponentially ratchet her up to a 15 or 16 power Tuvasa. And if she's done chip damage earlier in the game, which isn't just a possibility, but like a pretty consistent part of her game plan given her strategy, suddenly she is a lot more lethal. And opponents who thought that they had time to deal with her suddenly super don't. What these do isn't win more, what these do is shut the door. Speaking of which, Duelist's Heritage. I don't know why or how this isn't already a thing in this average Tuvasa list, but it needs to be. It's political, but even if you don't want to use it to help your opponents kill your other opponents, it just helps Tuvasa do it too, without ever risking falling off, like the double strike enchantment Battle Mastery. The final enchantment I'll add is the all-time classic Rancor. If Tuvasa perishes, this comes right back to our hand to get the draw chain started again. There's just one last swap I'll make here, and I'll cut the fetch land hiding in the mana base to make room. Not because fetch lands are bad, just because I don't want to presume that everyone owns one. The land I want to make sure to add before we finish up is Mosswort Bridge. This is really great for Voltron decks. Like, yeah, the tempo hit on a tapped single color land isn't ideal, but Tuvasa can meet this requirement all on her own very easily. And one free spell in this deck isn't just one free spell. It's a bunch of Enchantress triggers. If nothing else, Mosswort can avoid a card's typical timing restrictions, so you can basically flash in enchantments on opponents' turns to get her first enchantment draw trigger. This is nice utility, and Mosswort brings an added unique bonus to this deck in specific that it doesn't usually provide to other decks of the same archetype. So there we have it, our final Enchantress Voltron list. A link to the list can be found below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've had an enchanting visit with Tuvasa, and if you have any recommendations for your fellow enchantresses about cards that can help take their game to the next level, make sure you leave them in the comments below. And of course, let me know which commanders you would like to see next on the Upping the Average series. Thanks so much for watching.